Wait! The reactors are coming online! That's impossible! This ship has been dead for 200 years!
The distress signal was a whisper, a ghost echoing across the void for 2 centuries. They said Terran dreadnoughts were floating graveyards, stripped of life and power. But when the salvage crew breached the frozen hull, they didn't find corpses. They found an apex predator, merely sleeping. The deep space salvage vessel Manticore drifted silently through the obsidian expanse of Sector 4, a region of the galaxy long designated as a dead zone. Commander Harrison Boyd stood on the cramped, dimly lit bridge, his gaze fixed on the primary viewport. Outside, a sprawling debris field composed of shattered asteroids and the twisted metallic corpses of forgotten wars spun lazily in the void. Boyd was a veteran of the Coalition salvage fleet, a man whose face was lined with the stress of 100 near misses and 1,000 hollow discoveries. But today, the rhythmic ping of the deep-range scanners had shifted into a frantic, rhythmic chime that he hadn't heard in over a decade. "Commander, you need to see this," Pilot Mitchell Hayes said, his voice tight. Mitchell was a younger man, his hands flying across the tactile holographic displays with practiced efficiency. "I'm getting a massive silhouette behind the iron silicate asteroid cluster. It's not a rogue moon. The geometry is entirely artificial." Boyd stepped closer to the console, leaning over Mitchell's shoulder. "Give me a deep penetrating scan, multispectral. Filter out the background radiation." Filtering now, Science Officer Nathaniel Brooks chimed in from the starboard station. Nathaniel pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, staring intently at the raw data cascading down his screens. Mass profile is off the charts. We are looking at a construct at least 4 kilometers in length. Hull composition is heavily fortified titanium tungsten alloy, laced with a carbon nanotube matrix. Sir, this matches the exact metallurgical signature of pre-collapse Terran engineering. A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Terran. The word itself was a myth, a bedtime story told to frighten cadets in the Coalition academies. The ancient humans were said to have been a highly aggressive, impossibly inventive species that wiped themselves out in a final, apocalyptic clash with an unknown enemy over 200 years ago. Their ships were legendary, massive behemoths of war, supposedly left as derelict tombs drifting in the darkest corners of the cosmos. Everyone believed the human fleets were completely abandoned, stripped of power, their crews long reduced to cosmic dust. "Are you absolutely certain, Nathaniel?" Boyd asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Positive, Commander. Cross-referencing with the archive databases now. The structural design aligns with a Terran dreadnought, specifically an Olympus-class capital ship. General Dynamics Space Division and Lockheed Orbital jointly manufactured these monsters just before the Terran disappearance," Nathaniel replied, tapping his screen. "But here is the catch. There is 0 thermal output, no electromagnetic field, no ambient radiation from a fusion drive. It's sitting at absolute 0. It's a ghost ship. A ghost ship worth more credits than the entire Coalition High Council has in its treasury," interjected engineer Rebecca Carter. She stepped onto the bridge from the lower deck, wiping grease from her hands onto a rag. Her eyes were alight with a dangerous mix of greed and engineering curiosity. "If we can haul even a fraction of that technology back their quantum processing cores, their kinetic barrier emitters, we can buy our own moon." Boyd looked at his crew. He saw the apprehension in Mitchell's posture, the analytical detachment in Nathaniel's eyes, and the burning ambition in Rebecca's stance. He knew the risks. Sector 4 was notoriously unstable, and boarding a derelict of that size was essentially walking into a dark, frozen labyrinth. But Rebecca was right. The payoff was unimaginable. "Bring us in, Mitchell," Boyd finally ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Match their rotation. Keep our kinetic shields at maximum. Rebecca, prep the breaching gear. We're going to knock on the front door." The Manticore fired its maneuvering thrusters, slowly navigating through the treacherous debris field. As they cleared the massive asteroid blocking their view, the Terran dreadnought finally revealed itself in the harsh spotlight of the Manticore's forward beams. It was breathtakingly terrifying. The ship was a colossal spearhead of dark metal, scarred by micrometeorite impacts but structurally intact. Down its flank, massive letters, faded but still visible, spelled out its name, USS Vanguard. There were no lights, no signs of life, just a cold, silent leviathan sleeping in the dark. Mitchell expertly aligned the manticore with what appeared to be an aft airlock near the portside engine nacelles. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy, reverberating thud that echoed through the hull of the salvage ship. "Hard dock achieved," Mitchell announced, pressurizing the umbilical. "All right, listen up," Boyd said, turning to Nathaniel and Rebecca, who were already suiting up in heavy environmental armor. "We don't know what killed this ship. It could have been life support, failure, a biological weapon, or a reactor breach. Keep your suits sealed. Do not touch anything without scanning it first. We get in, we locate the main computer core, we extract the data drives, and we get out." The trio moved into the airlock. The heavy blast doors sealed behind them, and the indicator light flashed from green to red. As the outer door hissed open, they were met with the gaping, pitch-black maw of the USS Vanguard. The interior of the Vanguard was a frozen mausoleum. The beams from their suit-mounted flashlights cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating clouds of frozen atmosphere that sparkled like diamond dust in the zero-gravity environment. The corridors were vast, built with a utilitarian, brutalist efficiency that favored thick, armored bulkheads and exposed conduit lines over aesthetic comfort. "Magnetic boots on," Boyd ordered over the private comms channel. 3 synchronized thuds echoed through the empty corridor as they anchored themselves to the deck plating. Every step they took sent vibrations through the silent ship, a stark reminder that they were the first living beings to walk these halls in over 2 centuries. "Atmosphere is non-existent," Nathaniel reported, checking the readouts on his wrist-mounted terminal. "Trace amounts of nitrogen and oxygen, but it's entirely frozen. Ambient temperature is hovering just above 0 Kelvin. Radiation levels are surprisingly normal. There is no sign of a reactor breach." "Then why did it die?" Rebecca muttered, sweeping her flashlight over a massive, dormant terminal bearing the faded logo of a pre-collapsed tech conglomerate, Hewlett-Packard Stellar. A ship this size doesn't just run out of gas. They had sustained fusion technology. They could scoop hydrogen from nebulas and run indefinitely. They pressed deeper into the vessel, navigating through deactivated blast doors by manually overriding the hydraulic gears, a grueling, sweat-inducing process, even in the freezing cold. As they bypassed the engineering block and moved toward the central hab ring, the nature of the ship began to change. The corridors widened, and they began to find the first signs of the crew. Or rather, the lack thereof. "Commander," Nathaniel called out, his voice trembling slightly. He was standing at the entrance of a massive, cavernous bay. Boyd and Rebecca moved to his side, their lights sweeping across the room. It was a cryogenic bay, easily the size of a stadium. Lined up in perfectly symmetrical rows were thousands of stasis pods. They stretched on into the darkness, far beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. "Mother of God," Boyd whispered. They approached the nearest pod. The frost on the thick armorglass was heavy, but Rebecca carefully wiped it away with her gloved hand. Inside, bathed in the dim, residual glow of a chemical bioluminescence, was a human. He was a broad-shouldered man, wearing a sleek, charcoal-gray uniform. His eyes were closed, his face pale and frozen in an expression of peaceful slumber. "Are they dead?" Mitchell asked over the comms from the Manticore. Nathaniel pressed a portable diagnostic scanner against the pod's interface panel. He waited as the device chewed through the archaic encryption, a process that took several agonizing minutes. Finally, the screen blinked green. "No," Nathaniel breathed, his eyes widening behind his visor. "No, they aren't dead. The vital signs are suppressed to an almost undetectable level, but the cellular degradation is 0. They are in a state of hyper-deep cryosleep, built by Cryotech Industries. It's a closed-loop system running on an independent, microscopic isotope battery." "All of them?" Boyd asked, looking out over the sea of pods. "There have to be 10,000 soldiers in here." "At least," Nathaniel confirmed. "But Commander, look at this. I managed to slice into the pod's external manifest log." He tapped his wrist, projecting a holographic interface into the cold air. "This wasn't an emergency evacuation. This wasn't a last resort. This was a synchronized, fleet-wide tactical protocol." "Explain," Boyd demanded. The log was authorized by a Captain William Reynolds, Nathaniel read, his eyes scanning the glowing text. Date, the 14th of October, 2248. The entry reads, Operation Silent Hunter initiated. The swarm has breached the outer rim. Conventional warfare has failed. We cannot outgun them, so we will outlast them. We are plunging the fleet into the dark, shutting down all primary, secondary, and emergency power systems. We will become ghosts. Let them pass over us. When the time is right, when the trigger condition is met, the Vanguard will wake. A chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature ran down Boyd's spine. They didn't die out. They hid. They turned their ships into floating landmines. Commander, Rebecca's voice interrupted, laced with a sudden, sharp panic. She had wandered over to the main power relay station at the far end of the cryo bay, her tools out. I was trying to splice into the localized data core to download the ship's schematics. I needed to provide a microburst of power from my suit to bypass the physical lock. Rebecca, what did you do? Boyd barked, turning toward her. The relay, she stammered, backing away from the console. It wasn't dead. It was a tripwire, a passive induction loop. The moment my suit's power touched the node, it absorbed it. It consumed the charge. It's routing it down into the lower decks. Abort, Boyd yelled. Cut the connection. I already did, but it's too late. The circuit closed. Beneath their magnetized boots, the deck suddenly trembled. It was faint at first, a barely perceptible vibration, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant shifting in its slumber. The vibration beneath their feet grew from a subtle hum to a deep, resonant tremor that shook the dust from the ceiling conduits. In the vacuum of space, sound does not travel, but inside the pressurized suits of the salvage crew, the bone-rattling frequency of massive machinery grinding to life was unmistakable. Mitchell! Boyd shouted into his comms. Status! What is happening down there? Static hissed in Boyd's ear for a terrifying second before Mitchell's panicked voice broke through. Commander, I'm seeing a massive thermal spike deep in the bowels of the Vanguard. It's a cascading fusion reaction. One reactor just lit up. Now 2. Now 3. The energy output is exponential. Inside the cryo bay, the absolute darkness was shattered. Emergency strip lighting, running along the baseboards of the massive room, flared to life, casting an eerie, blood-red glow across the thousands of stasis pods. The temperature gauge on Nathaniel's HUD began to climb rapidly as the ship's internal atmospheric processors kicked in, violently pumping heated oxygen and nitrogen back into the frozen corridors. Gravity plating is coming online, Nathaniel yelled, right before the artificial gravity slammed into them. The transition from 0G to standard Earth gravity was brutal. The magnetic locks on their boots shorted out, and all 3 crew members were thrown to the metal deck. Boyd grunted as his shoulder absorbed the impact, his heavy armor clattering against the floor. He scrambled to his knees, his eyes darting wildly around the bay. The silence of the tomb was entirely gone, replaced by a deafening mechanical roar. The ship was not just waking up, it was screaming to life. Vents overhead blew thick streams of warm air, instantly vaporizing the frost that coated the walls and the cryopods, filling the cavernous room with a dense, white fog. Warning! A voice boomed, echoing from unseen speakers. It was a synthetic, calm, yet terrifyingly authoritative female voice, speaking in flawless, ancient Terran English. Trigger condition met. External power surge detected. Tactical hibernation disengaged. Initiating Protocol Lazarus. We need to leave. Right now, Boyd ordered, hauling himself to his feet and grabbing Rebecca by the arm. Nathaniel, move! They sprinted toward the heavy blast doors they had manually forced open, their boots pounding against the deck. But the Vanguard was no longer a dormant derelict. It was a fully operational warship, and its automated defense systems were rapidly coming online. As they reached the threshold of the cryo bay, the blast doors suddenly hissed and slammed shut with bone-crushing force, locking seamlessly into place. Boyd slammed his fists against the heavy titanium tungsten alloy, a futile gesture against a door designed to withstand a kinetic torpedo impact. Mitchell! The doors are sealed! Override them from the manticore! Boyd shouted into his comm. I can't, Commander! Mitchell's voice was frantic. The dreadnought cyber warfare suite just activated. It's slicing through my firewall like paper. It just locked me out of our own docking clamps. The manticore is held fast. We're trapped. Behind them, a new sound cut through the roar of the engines and the hissing of the air vents. It was a sharp, mechanical hiss-clack. Boyd, Rebecca, and Nathaniel slowly turned around, their backs pressed against the sealed blast door. Through the dissipating white fog, the blood-red emergency lights reflected off the armor-glass of the stasis pods. The internal bioluminescence of the pods was shifting from a dim green to a stark, piercing white. One by one, in a cascading wave that rippled down the rows of thousands of chambers, the heavy locking mechanisms of the cryopods began to disengage. Hiss-clack, hiss-clack, hiss-clack. The pod nearest to them, the one containing the broad-shouldered man, slowly pushed open. Thick, frigid mist spilled out over the deck. The man inside convulsed slightly as the hyper-oxygenated air hit his lungs. He took a sudden, violently deep breath, his chest heaving under his charcoal gray uniform. Then his eyes snapped open. They weren't the confused, disoriented eyes of a man waking from a 200-year sleep. They were sharp, focused, and burning with a predatory intensity. He stepped out of the pod, his boots hitting the deck with a heavy thud, seemingly entirely unaffected by the centuries of muscle atrophy. He reached into the compartment beside his pod, pulling out a sleek, lethal-looking kinetic assault rifle. In the background, hundreds, then thousands of silhouettes began to step out of their pods, rising from the fog like an army of the dead returning to reclaim the galaxy. The human raised his rifle, the weapon humming as its magnetic coils charged, and leveled it directly at Commander Boyd's chest. "Identify yourselves," the human commanded, his voice rough as sandpaper, yet carrying the undeniable authority of a species that had conquered the stars. "And give me one good reason why I shouldn't blow you out of my airlock." Boyd stared down the barrel of the weapon, realizing with a cold, terrifying certainty that the galaxy's greatest mystery hadn't been solved. It had been unleashed. The barrel of the kinetic assault rifle, stamped with the heavily faded but unmistakable logo of Heckler and Koch Orbital, remained perfectly steady. It was aimed squarely at the center of Commander Harrison Boyd's reinforced environmental suit, the magnetic coils along the weapon's sleek chassis emitting a low, deadly hum that vibrated in the tight space between the 3 salvage crew members and the newly awakened Terran. Boyd slowly raised his hands, his palms open, ensuring every micro-movement was broadcasted as non-threatening. Beside him, Rebecca Carter stood frozen, her tools slipping from her grasp to clatter noisily against the titanium tungsten deck plating. Nathaniel Brooks, whose breath was visibly hitching behind the polycarbonate visor of his helmet, looked as though he might faint. "I will ask you exactly one more time," the broad-shouldered human reiterated, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the cacophony of the awakening dreadnought. He did not blink. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, scanned the 3 of them with the cold, calculating precision of a targeting computer. "Identify yourselves. Give me your ship's registry, your commanding officer, and your current tactical allegiance. If you are sympathizers of the swarm, you have exactly 5 seconds to make your peace." "We are not enemies," Boyd shouted over the roar of the ship's atmospheric processors, desperately trying to keep his voice steady. "My name is Commander Harrison Boyd. This is Science Officer Nathaniel Brooks and Engineer Rebecca Carter. We are the crew of the Manticore, an independent salvage vessel operating under the legal registry of the Coalition Salvage Fleet. We aren't military. We aren't soldiers. And we have absolutely no idea what the swarm is." The human's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He did not lower the weapon, but he tilted his head slightly, as if processing the information against a set of internal parameters. Behind him, the cavernous expanse of the cryobay was a scene of terrifying, orchestrated chaos. Thousands of stasis pods had fully opened, spilling out legions of soldiers clad in the same charcoal gray uniforms and heavy-duty carbon-weave tactical armor. There was no grogginess, No stumbling disorientation typical of deep cryo revival. They moved with a synchronized, mechanical efficiency. Squad leaders were already barking orders, weapon lockers were being magnetically unsealed with heavy clanks, and diagnostic technicians were furiously tapping away at Palantir-branded predictive logistical terminals. "The Coalition?" the man asked, his tone skeptical. "There is no recognized stellar governing body called the Coalition. The United Nations Stellar Accord is the sole governing authority of this quadrant. And ignorance of the swarm is a tactical impossibility. They burned Reach, they glassed the Outer Rim colonies. Who sent you?" "Nobody sent us!" Rebecca blurted out, her voice cracking under the immense pressure. "We are scavengers! We found your ship drifting in a dead zone! We thought you were a ghost ship!" "Everyone thinks the Terran fleets have been dead for 200 years. That statement finally caused the human's iron facade to crack. The rifle barrel dipped a fraction of an inch. 200 years? He repeated, the words hanging heavily in the hyper-oxygenated air. He reached up with his free hand and tapped a comms unit embedded in the collar of his uniform. "O'Connor, give me an astronavigation readout. Cross-reference the stellar drift of the local pulsar network with our internal chronometers. What is the current date?" A moment later, a voice buzzed back through the localized frequency, loud enough for Boyd to hear. "Captain Reynolds, sir." The localized quantum chronometers are heavily desynchronized from the galactic standard, but based on the stellar decay of the Alpha Centauri binary system. "Sir, it's the year 2453. We've been in the dark for 205 years. Captain William Reynolds lowered the rifle completely, though his posture remained rigid. He stared past Boyd, looking at the heavy blast doors, his mind clearly racing through centuries of missing history in mere seconds. The terrifying reality of their situation was settling over the vanguard. The soldiers nearest to them paused, their heads turning toward their commanding officer as the transmission echoed through their own earpieces. 2 centuries, Reynolds murmured, more to himself than to the salvage crew. He suddenly snapped his attention back to Boyd. If the swarm didn't eradicate the galaxy, and the Terran fleets have been written off as derelict tombs, what happened? Who won the war? There was no war, Boyd answered carefully, taking a slow step forward. At least, not one that is recorded in any modern historical archive. 200 years ago, there was a massive galactic collapse. The archives call it the Great Silence. Entire star systems went dark. The human species, your people, were said to have wiped themselves out in a localized, apocalyptic civil war involving outlawed exotic weaponry. The rest of the galaxy slowly rebuilt from the ashes, forming the Coalition High Council to ensure peace and regulate the recovery of lost technologies. A civil war? Reynolds scoffed, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. Is that what they told you? We didn't fight ourselves. We fought a biological contagion, a hive mind parasitic species that didn't just conquer planets, it consumed them. It assimilated the indigenous populations, stealing their biology and their technology. We called them the Swarm. When our conventional fleets, our Boeing Lockheed battle groups, couldn't stop them from overrunning the core worlds, High Command realized we were providing them with too much biomass. Every soldier we sent was another weapon for them to assimilate. Reynolds stepped closer, towering over Boyd. So, we initiated Operation Silent Hunter. The entire Terran Heavy fleet jumped into deep space, powered down our reactors to absolute zero, and froze ourselves. We left automated listening posts scattered across the galaxy, programmed to monitor the swarm's expansion. The trigger condition to wake us was simple. Either the swarm starved to death without our biomass to feed on, or they found us and triggered our defensive grid. Your engineer tripping our power relay initiated an emergency revival protocol. Nathaniel, still shaking, finally found his voice. "Captain, if the swarm were a biological assimilation threat, and they won, they wouldn't have just vanished." His eyes widened behind his visor as a horrifying realization dawned on him. Commander Boyd, the Coalition High Council. Think about their policies, the absolute isolationism of the core worlds. The strict ban on deep space exploration. the designation of dead zones, like Sector 4, where any unauthorized ship is shot on sight. Boyd's blood ran cold. The Coalition wasn't a governing body that rose from the ashes. It was a facade. The swarm didn't starve, Boyd whispered, the horror of the revelation sinking in. They assimilated the remaining alien species after humanity disappeared. They didn't want to conquer a dead galaxy. They needed livestock. They created the Coalition to manage the population, keeping everyone docile, isolated, and ignorant. Sector 4 isn't a dead zone because it's dangerous. It's a dead zone because they didn't want anyone finding the human fleets. They rewrote history, Rebecca added, her voice trembling. They turned humans into a myth, a boogeyman, to make sure no one ever went looking for the only weapons capable of stopping them. Reynolds' expression hardened, the brief flash of shock replaced by a terrifying, cold fury. The apex predator had realized the prey was not only alive, but had stolen its territory. He keyed his comms again. "Major Jackson," Reynolds barked, his voice echoing with unquestionable authority. "Sound General Quarters. Bring the General Electric hyperfusion drives to 100% capacity. Spool up the Raytheon kinetic defense grids. Tell the armory to unseal the nuclear payloads. We aren't hiding anymore." "Sir," Jackson's voice replied, tight with adrenaline. "The main computer core is fully online. We are detecting an immediate threat." The microburst of power from the civilian suit didn't just wake us up. It sent a tachyon ripple across the sector. Long-range scanners are picking up a massive spatial distortion. Someone just opened a slip-space rupture 20,000 kilometers off our port bow. It's a Coalition dreadnought, heavy cruiser class. And, sir, their thermal and biomechanical signatures matched the swarm databanks with a 99% probability. "They felt the tripwire," Reynolds said grimly. He turned to Boyd, his eyes burning with a sudden violent light. "Commander Boyd, it appears your salvage mission just turned into a rescue operation for the galaxy. Follow me to the Combat Information Center. I need you to tell me exactly how these bastards fight." "You can't take on a Coalition dreadnought alone," Boyd protested as Reynolds grabbed his arm and hauled him toward the inner corridors. "They have plasma shielding and directed energy weapons that can slice a moon in half. Your ship is 200 years old." Reynolds didn't even slow down. He just looked over his shoulder, a terrifying grin spreading across his face. "Son," Reynolds said, the metal deck vibrating beneath them as the U.S. Vanguard truly awoke. We are Terrans. We don't use plasma. We use math, gravity, and very, very heavy rocks. Let's go introduce them to the ghosts. The Combat Information Center of the USS Vanguard was a vast, circular amphitheater of warfare. Unlike the sleek, holographic-heavy, minimalist bridges of Coalition vessels, the Terran CIC was a brutalist masterpiece of functionality. Rows of sunken tactical pits were filled with operators strapping themselves into crash couches. Massive physical toggle switches and heavily armored analog backups lined the bulkheads. In the center of the room, a colossal, three-dimensional tactical holodable projected the surrounding space in stark wireframe blue. Boyd, Rebecca, and Nathaniel stood near the command dais, entirely out of their depth, watching an ancient machine of war operate with a fluid, terrifying grace. "Helm, disengage the civilian vessel's docking clamps," Reynolds ordered, taking his position at the center console. He didn't sit. He stood tall, his hands braced against the railing. "Push them away with maneuvering thrusters. I don't want their hull compromised when we execute combat maneuvers." "Clamp disengaged, Captain," the helmsman confirmed. "Civilian vessel Manticore is drifting clear." "Target acquired," Major Jackson announced from the weapons pit. His hands flew across a keyboard that looked robust enough to survive a direct hammer strike, designating as Hostile Alpha. They are currently 20,000 kilometers out and closing fast. Velocity is 0.05 c. They are heavily shielded. Energy readings indicate a localized multiphasic plasma barrier. On the central holodable, the red icon of the Coalition cruiser, the Swarm vessel, glowed menacingly. It was sleek, organic in design, resembling a massive obsidian predatory fish swimming through the void of space. They are broadcasting on all open frequencies, Communications Officer Miller reported. It's an automated coalition dispersal order. They are demanding our immediate surrender, claiming we are in violation of Section 4 quarantine protocols. They state they will open fire in 30 seconds if we do not power down our reactors. Do not respond, Reynolds commanded calmly. Let them wonder who is driving the ghost ship. Jackson, spool up the primary MAC cannons, batteries 1 through 4. MAC cannons, Nathaniel whispered, leaning closer to Boyd. Magnetic accelerator cannons? The Coalition outlawed those a century ago. They cause too much collateral damage. They literally crack planetary crusts. We are about to see why, Boyd murmured, his eyes glued to the tactical display. Deep within the spine of the Vanguard, a sound began to build. It was a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the very soles of their boots, traveling up their legs and into their chests. It was the sound of colossal electromagnetic coils drawing gargantuan amounts of power from the hyperfusion reactors, charging a weapon that relied on pure, unadulterated kinetic physics. Hostile Alpha is powering up directed energy weapons, Jackson called out. Thermal spikes detected along their forward spines. They are locking onto our central mass. Let them shoot first, Reynolds said, his voice eerily calm. I want to test their output against our armor. Brace for impact. The CIC crew instantly locked down their harnesses. Boyd, Rebecca, and Nathaniel grabbed onto the reinforced guardrails of the command dais. On the holotable, brilliant beams of searing green plasma erupted from the swarm cruiser. In the vacuum of space, they crossed the 20,000 kilometers in a fraction of a second. The beams struck the Vanguard with the force of a localized sun. The dreadnought shuddered violently. The sound of metal groaning under extreme thermal stress echoed through the CIC, accompanied by the blare of localized damage alarms. The lights flickered, casting the room in strobing darkness for a heartbeat before the auxiliary systems engaged. "Damage report!" Reynolds barked, gripping the console. "Direct hit to our forward portside ablative armor plating," the engineering officer yelled over the din. "Outer hull breached, but the secondary tungsten carbide spall liner held. Armor thickness in Sector 4 is reduced by 30%. Internal temperatures in adjacent corridors spiked, but auto-coolants have already neutralized the threat. Sir, their plasma didn't even penetrate the structural skeleton." Boyd stared at the readouts in absolute shock. A hit like that from a Coalition cruiser would have vaporized the Manticore and crippled any modern battleship. The Terran dreadnought had simply absorbed it like a punch to a heavy bag. The humans hadn't built ships. They had built flying anvils. They rely entirely on thermal energy transfer, Reynolds analyzed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. They forgot that we built our hulls to withstand atmospheric re-entry at combat speeds without shields. Their weapons are flashy, but they lack kinetic punch. Reynolds leaned over the comm system, his eyes locked on the red blip of the swarm vessel. "Major Jackson, return fire. Target their center mass. Let's see how their multi-phasic plasma barrier handles a 2-ton slug of depleted uranium moving at 0.04 light speed. Fire MAC cannons 1 and 2. Firing 1 and 2. Jackson confirmed, slamming his fist down on the heavy, red analog firing stud. The Vanguard didn't just shudder, it kicked like a massive, angry mule. The recoil of the magnetic accelerator cannons violently shoved the 4-kilometer-long dreadnought backward in space, the inertial dampeners screaming in protest. From the twin prongs at the bow of the Terran ship, 2 massive projectiles were hurled into the void. There was no bright flash of laser light, no glowing plasma. There was only the invisible, terrifying application of raw, localized gravity and magnetic force propelling solid mass at relativistic speeds. On the holotable, the results were instantaneous and catastrophic. The 2 depleted uranium slugs crossed the void and slammed into the swarm cruiser's multiphasic plasma barrier. Plasma shields were designed to diffuse and absorb energy weapons, scattering the heat across a wide surface area. They were entirely incapable of stopping a dense physical object traveling with that much kinetic momentum. The first slug punched through the shield as if it were made of wet tissue paper, instantly collapsing the energy field in a spectacular burst of blue static. A microsecond later, the second slug impacted the physical hull of the swarm cruiser. There was no explosion. Not at first. The sheer velocity of the impact caused the swarm vessel's organic metallic hull to instantly liquefy and shatter upon contact. The 2-ton slug caved in the front third of the cruiser, driving its own mass backward through the ship's internal decks, obliterating bulkheads, crew, and machinery in a fraction of a second. The kinetic shockwave rippled through the enemy ship, tearing it apart from the inside out. Only then did the swarm cruiser's dark matter reactor, compromised by the massive internal trauma, lose containment. The ship violently detonated, expanding into a silent, brilliant sphere of blinding white light and expanding debris. Silence fell over the CIC of the Vanguard. The red icon on the holotable had simply vanished, replaced by a rapidly expanding cloud of shrapnel and frozen gas. Boyd slowly released his death grip on the railing, his knuckles white. He had just witnessed the destruction of a top-tier coalition warship in a matter of seconds, eradicated by a weapon that hadn't seen the light of day in over 2 centuries. "Target destroyed," Major Jackson reported, his voice betraying a hint of savage satisfaction. "No escape pods detected. The hostile vessel has been completely neutralized." "Stand down from condition red, but keep the reactors hot," Reynolds ordered, finally stepping back from the console. He turned to face the 3 scavengers, the grim reality of the situation fully settling upon him. The test was over. The theory was proven. The swarm was still out there, hiding behind the masks of the governments they had supposedly left behind. "You didn't just survive," Rebecca whispered, looking at Reynolds with a mixture of awe and terror. "You're going to burn their entire empire to the ground, aren't you? They took our home, they forced us into the dark, they twisted our sacrifice into a lie to enslave the rest of the galaxy," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "We didn't sleep for 200 years just to wake up and forgive them." Reynolds walked over to the communications array, towering over the seated officer. "Miller, I need you to tap into the ship's primary tachyon broadcasting array. Bypass local encryption and use the pre-collapsed Terran military frequencies. I want a wide beam transmission, maximum power. Bounce it off every pulsar and relay station you can find. Send it into the deepest, darkest trenches of every dead zone in this galaxy." "Sir, what is the message?" Miller asked, his hands hovering over the ancient keyboard. Reynolds looked back at the holotable, the blue wireframe projection casting long shadows across his hardened, battle-scarred face. The myth of the human race was over. The reality was about to begin. "Broadcast the activation codes for Operation Lazarus," Captain Reynolds ordered, the weight of his command echoing through the silent, highly advanced tomb that had just become the flagship of a reborn armada. "Tell the Nemesis, the Leviathan, the Ares, and the rest of the sleeping fleet that the trigger condition has been universally met. The hunt is back on. Tell them to wake up." As the communications officer hit the transmit key, sending an invisible wave of archaic data screaming across the cosmos, Commander Boyd realized the absolute truth. The galaxy didn't need to fear the ghosts of humanity. It needed to fear the monsters they had become to survive. The engines of the Vanguard roared. A defiant challenge hurled into the endless dark, and the Terrans went to war. If you felt the adrenaline rush as the Vanguard roared to life, don't leave this sector just yet. Smash that like button to power up our ship's reactors, share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a transmission. The humans have awakened, and the galaxy will never be the same. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you woke up a sleeping dreadnought? See you in the next episode.